Good afternoon from the Philippines, good morning, and good evening to friends and guests who are joining us from other parts of the globe. My name is Daniel Ratilla, the Program Officer for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and I will be serving as your host for today's session. It is my honor to welcome you all to our fourth and final session of our second webinar series for the year, Climate Research as if People Mattered. The name draws inspiration from the article Small is Beautiful, Climate Change Science as if People Mattered, which was written by Dr. Regina Rodriguez and Dr. Theodore Shepard, co-chairs of the Science Plan Development Team of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. It reflects on insights from E.F. Schumacher's celebrated book, Small is Beautiful, that may be applied in closing the gap between how climate information is being produced and used. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had a very dynamic session with Dr. Ines Ponce de Leon about climate communication that goes beyond information packaging. If you are a returning participant, it's great to have you with us again on the last session for the year. But if this is your first time joining one of our webinars, we hope that you stick around for the end of the session to find out how you can watch the replays of our previous webinars and stay updated on the Hub's activities. Today's session is titled Shifting from Handover to Handshake, Co-Generating Climate Change Information for Resilience. This webinar series is organized by the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, which is hosted by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. And this session is also co-hosted by the Manila Observatory. My Climate Risk, or MCR, is a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, which aims to develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to regional climate risk. In our previous series, we strove to have a better understanding of local contexts and experiences of climate change and the requirements of decision-maker. In this webinar series, we explore how the different contexts and experiences of climate change are considered and how we may apply these in research design and management plans. Today's session in particular will focus on co-generating climate change information. What does it mean to shift from handing over information to co-generating information? And what does this shift mean for resilience? We will learn about all of this and more in our session in a bit. Just some quick reminders before we start the session. So just to enumerate some of the quick reminders. First, please note that the program is being recorded on Zoom. Second, on Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. Third, throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions in the chat box here on Zoom. Participants via Facebook Live may also type in their comments or questions in the comments section. We will collect these for the open forum later on. And finally, there will be an evaluation survey at the end of the session. Requests for e-certificates may be made through the same form. At this point, we would like to ask everyone to settle in for the prayer to be followed by the Philippine National Anthem. An interfaith prayer for our climate. Let us give thanks for the world around us. Thanks for all the creatures, stones, and plants. Let us learn their lessons and seek their truths so that their path might be ours, and we might live in harmony a better life. May the earth continue to live. May the heavens above continue to live. May the rains continue to dampen the land. May the wet forests continue to grow. Then the flowers shall bloom, and we people shall live again.
Magiliw sa silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang hinigaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
And now, to formally welcome everyone to today's session, may we call on Father Jose Ramon T. Villarin of the Society of Jesus, the Executive Director of the Manila Observatory and the collaborator of the MCR Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, to deliver the opening remarks.
Thank you, Daniel, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of our colleagues who are in this gathering. On behalf of the Manila Observatory, I'm pleased to co-host. We are pleased to co-host this event, and we are particularly excited because we have with us Dr. who heads our regional climate laboratory. Dr. Faye, and I were just in Sharm el Sheikh for COP27. Faye was part of the Philippine delegation, and I was just an observer. But I have been through these COPs before, and I was really pleasantly surprised, sort of, to note that there were about 35,000 people in this gathering. I used to be part of the delegation back when it was still single-digit COPs, COP 4, 5, 6, and there were not that many people. And at that time, you just had a handful of negotiators and some scientists slugging it out, trying to come up with meaningful policies and decisions. This time, though, I was pleasantly surprised to see so many people from all walks of life, from so many sectors attending, and pleasantly surprised to see a lot of young people as well. Usually in these conferences, you have a lot of old people. And so to see a lot of these young people gave me hope. Climate science or climate change initially began really from the top. You would say it was a top-down affair. We know that it began with a science question. It was really a what-if question. At the turn of the 20th century, a scientist named Svante Arrhenius, he just speculated that what if we double CO2? What will happen? Will the temperature increase? And that has been a live question, which actually touches what we call climate sensitivity of the planet. So this top-down question, fortunately, has spilled over into more than just the science, the borders of science. And we realize now that climate change is more than just a science issue, that it is a live and a social and political and economic issue. And so the input from other sectors has been instrumental as well. Now, I'm quite intrigued by the title, From Handover to Handshake. And I am also excited to listen to what Faye has to share from her own experience. But in truth, we scientists, and I guess I am a trained scientist also, but we we don't have a monopoly on this issue, and therefore the imperative really to listen to what others have to say. And there is a danger, of course, as we know, because of climate misinformation or disinformation that is out there, that is also coming from all sorts of people. And yet we know, and from my own experience, and most probably from Faye's own experience as well, that even those at the grassroots, they can discern these patterns, these disruptions, these changes that are already happening. I like to tell the story of, well, when I was about 18 years old, I spent about a week with some farmers, and at that time we had no watches, and it was the last day. It was already after harvest, and we had finished clearing the land. And my foster father just said, Chet, he looked at the sun, the angle of the sun, and says, "You'll be late for your bus." He knew the time just from looking at the angle of the sun at that time of year. There are also places in the Philippines, especially among fisher folk, where they have all sorts of descriptions of waves and the wind. I remember also particularly in somewhere in the southeast of Samar Island, if you cross from Giwan to Homonhon, that is where Magellan and his ship first landed. It's a treacherous crossing, but the fisher folk have a way of counting waves before making that crossing. And it's because they have, over the years, or maybe decades or centuries, they've seen these patterns. They can spot these changes. Climate is nothing but patterns, really, patterns of weather. And we've seen that these changes are about us, are now here. And we'd really like to know how these patterns will change. Anyhow, I just stop there and welcome you all also as director of the observatory. And we look forward to this enlightening talk from Faye, who will share with us her own experience of predicting or forecasting these patterns of climate. Thank you, and good day to all of us.
Thank you very much, Father Villarian, for welcoming us to the session. It fills many of us with hope that we are all indeed part of the journey to address the climate crisis, and our numbers only continue to grow. And of course, on behalf of the audience, I would also like to thank both you and Dr. Cruz for being a part of the recent COP at Sharm el-Sheikh. Moving to the next part of our program, it is now my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's session. Dr. Faye Cruz is a climate scientist and head of the Regional Climate Systems Laboratory at the Manila Observatory in the Philippines. She is actively involved in atmospheric and climate research in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia, and has been part of international collaborative projects, such as the Coordinated Regional Climate Downscaling Experiment, or CORDEX, Southeast Asia project. With her experience in climate data analysis and use of regional climate models, Dr. Cruz has worked on projects with scientists and various stakeholders to provide enhanced climate change information for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Recently, she was a lead author in the IPCC AR6 Climate Change 2021, The Physical Science Basis, and a contributing author to the 2016 Philippine Climate Change Assessment, The Physical Science Basis, and the Philippine Climate Extremes Report 2020. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Faye Abigail Cruz. Dr. Cruz, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the introduction, and thank you also, Father Jet, for the opening message. Good day to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. First, I'd like to thank My Climate Risk, Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, specifically Dr. Kendra, Jean, and Daniel for organizing this very insightful webinar series, and also for the kind invitation to be part of this series so that I may share some of my reflections on what it means to do climate research as if people mattered, based on our experiences at the Manila Observatory. I'd like to preface this talk by acknowledging that I'm still very much a student of the transdisciplinary approach to climate change research. And so my reflections mainly come from the perspective of the scientist or as a producer of climate information. I understand that this webinar series draws inspiration from the Rodriguez and Shepard paper, and it was very interesting to see how much I can relate to this paper. And so in this presentation, you may be seeing some parallels to that paper. I will just share I forget that I am just going to share my screen. And so I hope that it's now, you can now see. So for this talk, I'd like to follow this flow, which I first heard mentioned in one of the recent workshops I've attended online. And this is how can we move from climate data to information, to knowledge, and to wisdom towards achieving climate resilience. So if you may recall, according to the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, it is clear that human activities have caused the observed warming that has resulted in the changes in climate that we are experiencing in every region on Earth and in multiple ways. And this has profoundly affected human society and ecosystems. With every additional warming in the future, we can expect larger changes in climate, including more intense and more frequent climate extremes, which increases the risks we face in the future and pose limits to adaptation. So in the face of these current and future climate changes, how can we produce understandable, relevant, and useful climate information to adapt and build our resilience? The AR6 continues to adopt the IPCC risk framework, which identifies the 3 main elements that affect risk, namely hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. So in this case, we take hazards to be affected by the changes in natural climate variability and human-induced climate changes. And exposure and vulnerability would be affected by socioeconomic processes. It is crucial to understand the hazards through robust scientific knowledge of climate change and climate variability at scales ranging from global to regional to local scales to better inform risk assessment and for risk reduction and mitigation. Projections of future temperature, rainfall, and other climate variables are obtained from these global climate models. And these are computer programs essentially that solve physically based mathematical equations of the climate system. They typically have low or coarse spatial resolutions, but this could be problematic for areas such as the Philippines, which have complex topography and small islands. And so for these past decades, the regional climate community has been working towards modeling and generating high-resolution climate data from these global climate models through downscaling techniques. And so, as we can see in this figure, showing the future change in rainfall, we can get more detailed information of which areas will be drier or wetter in the future. Downscaling, or the process of getting more detailed climate information, is necessary since there is spatial variability in hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and impacts. So in this example, the maps here illustrate areas in the Philippines affected by strong typhoons between 2009 and 2017, and the consequent economic damages would vary per region. So we could see that some areas would have experienced more damages compared to other areas. Projections of future, we can get climate data from observations, for example, from weather stations and from satellites. So for the Manila Observatory, we have been maintaining a number of automated weather stations within Metro Manila and over the Philippines to complement other observation networks such as that of PAG-ASA, the Philippine Weather Bureau. Another source of climate data would be from climate models, as I mentioned earlier. And to look into the future, we examine different emission scenarios that come from socioeconomic scenarios that consider future developments, population trends, energy and land use, and so on, including whether we do nothing and continue with business as usual, or if we do something and reduce and avoid greenhouse gas emissions. We have had different ways in creating these scenarios. So a couple of years ago, we had what we call the representative concentration pathways, or the RCPs. And in this recent assessment report of the IPCC, we have now made use of emission scenarios called the shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. These different scenarios result in different CO2 concentrations in the future, which we then use as information to the global climate models to see how the climate responds. For example, how will temperature, rainfall, winds, and so on change due to future changes in greenhouse gas concentrations? Then we need to do downscaling, which could be through the use of regional climate models or through statistical methods. And this would be to generate data at higher resolution. We try to use as many scenarios and climate models because we wish to cover a range of plausible outcomes. An example of output of this process would be this figure from PAG-ASA, which I borrowed. And this shows the range of future temperatures of the Philippines until the end of the century under 2 emission scenarios. As you could see, this process can be very resource intensive and time consuming. So this could limit the number of scenarios and models that we could use. One way to address this challenge is through collaboration with other institutions. And since 2013, the Manila Observatory has been part of Cordex Southeast Asia, which is a group of scientists within and outside of Southeast Asia that work together to do the task sharing in downscaling climate projections and also in capacity building. Cordex Southeast Asia is actually part of Cordex, which is a project also of the WCRP. We have also worked with PAG-ASA recently to consolidate the projections we have produced through our networks, and I will be also showing some of this output later on. Regional climate change information results from the analysis from multiple lines of evidence, which includes the climate data from observations and models, and also information from scientific literature, process understanding, and input from climate experts. Through the processing, consolidation, and analysis of this data, we are able to look at trends, variability, changes in the means, in the climate averages, and in the climate extremes. We are able to make sense of the data, define baseline values or climate normals, and see whether an event, for example, a heavy rainfall or a typhoon, is extreme, that is, if it's way above the average, and to see how temperature and rainfall will change in the future, for example, in this figure. And we could see how higher temperatures would be expected and generally drier conditions on average by the 2050s under the high emission scenario relative to present day, which is in this case taken to be from the period 1986 to 2005. However, this is just from the physical science perspective. And so we wonder whether this information is useful. When we present this information, more often than not, we get comments that these are too technical. And so perhaps this is because this information needs to be explained in a particular context to be relatable, understandable, and useful. In one of our recently concluded projects, which we did with Ateneo and Pag-asa, and this was funded by DSTP Shared, we tried to reach out to climate end users to understand their climate information needs. One of the main products we have aimed for this project was a dataset on future climate extremes, specifically on temperature and rainfall for the Philippines. And this would be described in a technical report. And we want these products to be useful for policy and decision makers. And so last July 2019, we conducted a stakeholder workshop on climate information for local adaptation in the Philippines, where we have invited representatives from national government agencies and also from the local governments, specifically from Tubigon, Bohol, Tiwi, Albay, Tuguegarao, Cagayan, and Pasig Metro Manila. In this workshop, we wanted to present the initial scientific findings on future climate change in the Philippines and its possible applications in national and local adaptation. Within each LGU unit, we made sure to invite representatives from the different sectors, such as from agriculture, health, and disaster risk reduction. And through this workshop, we wanted to understand better our end users, how they understood climate change, where do they get their information, which climate information do they use, and how we can try to tailor our study and outputs accordingly to their needs. Some of the key findings include the need for climate education, for example, to address any confusion between weather and climate, as well as to explain climate projections. From the LGUs present, climate information is used in addressing disaster risk reduction and infrastructure planning. Lack of technical capacity and funding were also the most cited barriers in the use of climate information in their planning and policymaking. And finally, they also mentioned that temperature and rainfall extremes were relevant for their use. We followed up this stakeholder workshop with consultations, bilateral consultations with selected LGUs in March 2020. This included visits to Tubigon, Bohol, Del Carmen, Siargao, Diwan, Eastern Samar. We also visited Tiwi, Albay, but unfortunately, during the time that the team was there, we have received information of the COVID-19 lockdown in Metro Manila. So we had to cancel the visit, and so all of the other activities were also postponed. Nevertheless, these consultations were useful in getting feedback from the LGUs on the presentation of the maps and tables in the climate extremes report we were preparing. They also said that videos would be useful and as a guide in the use of the climate information and also for climate education. Other recommendations include the production of localized climate data, information on climate impacts on priority sectors, and wider dissemination of climate reports. In terms of application, guidance on how this climate information can be used in local climate change action plans and in the application for the People Survival Fund, which can support adaptation projects, as well as potential climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction options were also recommended. A second stakeholder workshop was initially planned as a follow-up, and this aimed to increase understanding of sector-specific climate extremes indices to end users, determine usability and appropriateness of the project outputs to local plans through consultations, and to build the capacity of local government to use observed and projected climate data for local plans. But again, unfortunately, this did not materialize because of the COVID-19 lockdowns in the past years. In any case, we tried our best to incorporate the suggestions and input from our LGU partners into the Philippine Climate Extremes Report 2020, as shown here. In this report, future changes in temperature and rainfall extremes in the Philippines were presented based on the models and emission scenarios used in the 5th assessment report. We show maps of the climate extremes indices in the present day from 1986 to 2005, and their projected changes in the future from the near future from 2020 to 2039, mid-future from 2046 to 2065, and the far future from 2080 to 2099. The report shows that with increasing global temperatures, heat extremes over the Philippines will increase, and there will also be changes towards both wet and dry extremes. We can see this in these maps that except for Northwest Luzon, there is an overall drying tendency over the country, as shown in shades of brown, but more extreme rainfall events are also projected in some areas, such as over North Luzon, Bicol region, and Western Mindanao, particularly at the end of the century. Also included in the report are the observed and projected values of climate extremes indices that we have summarized per province in the form of tables, as shown here. So with one row, we have each extremes index, and each row is grouped into magnitude, frequency, and duration attributes. We have a table for the temperature extremes, and we also have another table for the rainfall extremes. One example application of this climate information is that it can be used as input with other planning tools, particularly the Climate Extremes Risk Analysis Matrix, or CERAM, as shown here. CERAM is designed to integrate climate information in planning for socioeconomic development, climate change adaptation, greenhouse gas mitigation, and disaster risk reduction and management. It is adapted from the CLIRAM, or the Climate Information Risk Analysis Matrix, which is currently being used in the Climate and Disaster Risk Assessment, or the CIDRA process, which is used by the local governments in their adaptation planning. These efforts in ensuring climate change information is usable, understandable, and relevant can also be seen in the global scale. I borrowed the phrase "from handover to handshake" from IPCC, which was an approach adopted for the 6th assessment report. To just recall, there are actually 3 working groups within the IPCC. So the Working Group 1 report focuses on the physical science basis of climate change. Working Group 2 focuses on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and Working Group 3 on mitigation options. Apart from special reports like the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, on climate change and land, and on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, which are all cross-working group reports, the working group reports of the individual groups tend to focus within their remit or subject areas. However, in the 6th assessment report, there was a more conscious effort in working together across groups, hence from handover to handshake. This meant that some of the Working Group 2 authors and some of the Working Group 3 authors would participate in the discussions of Working Group 1 and vice versa. I was actually part of Chapter 12 of Working Group 1, and this chapter assessed the climate change information relevant to regional impact and risk assessment. And in this figure, it shows how information from this chapter bridges between the Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 reports. So in this example, we could see how exposure and vulnerability information would identify key climatic impact driver indices that would be relevant for those sectors affected. And we could refer to chapters within Working Group 1 to talk about the physical processes that would be involved in affecting the trends and extremes, which would then result in changes in the key climatic impact driver indices. And the information on the changes in the climatic impact drivers, as well as in the exposure and vulnerability, would then inform the changing profile of risk. So I've been mentioning about the climatic impact drivers, and this was actually one way to ensure that the climate change information has sectoral relevance. So this concept of CIDs help translate the physical changes in climate, for example, heat and cold, wet and dry, winds, coastal flooding and erosion, among others, into what they mean to society and ecosystems. It is not just looking at the gradual changes in temperature, rainfall, and sea levels, but also to see whether these exceed thresholds that can have severe consequences for people and for different sectors. So through the years, we see that it's not enough to just produce climate data and information, but also ensure that it is used in impacts assessment and decision-making. Climate knowledge therefore results from the engagement between climate scientists and end users, including the vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation, or the VIA community, and decision makers, which can be achieved through climate services and involves what we call data distillation, which means producing usable and understandable information from raw data. And we combine this with information from economic, social, and political sciences, and also ideally considering indigenous traditional knowledge. One example that this can be done is through the Climate and Disaster Risk Assessment, or the CIDRA process, which is considered as the first step toward building truly resilient communities. By conducting CIDRA, communities can identify the root causes of risk while also gaining insight into potential impacts at the local level, thus helping them make evidence-based decisions on appropriate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. This was one of the activities done under the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project for the cities of Iloilo, Naga, and Metro Manila. So in this project, we have had consultations with LGUs who are part of the project to determine which climate hazards would be their concern, and so we can prioritize this in our climate analysis. Case studies that reflect the knowledge gained from the collaboration of these different institutions and disciplines with the stakeholders can be found in this resilience toolkit of the project. This is a knowledge database designed to help disaster management planners, risk resilience practitioners, and also local governments to refer and use various technologies to enhance their cities' climate and disaster resilience. These studies can be used as reference. However, care should be taken since an approach or a strategy that can work for one city does not necessarily mean it can work for another. This emphasizes the importance of contextualizing local climate information in combination with the local information on exposure, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity to understand the particular risk profile of the city in order to plan appropriately and to avoid maladaptation. So how do we move from knowledge to wisdom in achieving climate resilience? It took me a while to reflect on this, and I think that since wisdom involves values, then values become essential in considering which climate actions to pursue. One example could be climate resilient development, as introduced in the AR6 Working Group 2, and this recognizes the interconnections among climate, human society, and ecosystems, including biodiversity. While risks from climate change, ecosystem degradation, and biodiversity loss stem from these interactions, this also provides opportunities and solutions. Climate resilient development is a solutions framework that combines strategies to adapt to climate change with actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as conserves and restores ecosystems to support sustainable development. However, climate resilient development is already challenging at current global warming levels, so it is necessary to keep our goal of limiting warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius so that the options will not become further limited. Before I end my talk, here are some final thoughts that I have on what it means to shift from handing over information to co-creating information and what this shift means for resilience. Co-creating or co-generating climate information is essential if we want this information to be useful and understandable. Hence, it is important to understand the needs and capabilities of the users to have a proper context for this information and that it is appropriate for their needs. So this requires increased and continued engagement between climate providers and users. It takes time and effort, certainly, especially since it means going outside of our intellectual comfort zones. And it means understanding each other's languages, jargons, processes, and methods. And we also need, on the climate science side, we also need to be able to communicate the information and updates, the strengths and weaknesses of some methodologies, and the uncertainties and limits in projections that the end users may need to consider when they use this climate data. And as pointed out by a colleague, it also takes humility in accepting that we don't know everything. Initially, I thought of collaboration, but I thought that maybe it means even going further in establishing that we need to establish a community, since climate change affects everyone and all ecosystems, and it takes a whole of society approach to address this climate crisis. Finally, when we make decisions towards building climate resilience, it's important that these actions are integrated, considering not just climate-related hazards, but also other natural and human-induced hazards, considering socio-economic and political considerations. And these approaches or solutions should also be just, since these decisions and actions not only affect a particular community, but mainly the most vulnerable. And these decisions also affect ecosystems and future generations. So I end with my talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion after.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cruz. That was such an interesting and eye-opening presentation. Co-creating information really does require increased collaboration among actors and I think breaking barriers to science and solutions. So indeed, from collaboration to becoming a community. At this point of the program, we will now be having our open forum. We've received a few questions from the chat and we'll be reading them. I have the first question from the chat box, which is from Dr. Ted Shepard. It's great to have you with us again, Dr. Shepard. His question reads, your very first slide suggested the paradigm data to information to knowledge to wisdom. But from what you say, shouldn't it be more like wisdom to knowledge to data to information?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I suggested to follow that paradigm, mostly more of coming from our experience, in that we used when we first came into this understanding climate change, it was mainly on the science side, and but only after some time through the interactions in the projects that we realized that it's not enough that we just focus on the science, but also to make sure that the data and information that we find is useful and relevant. And so that was what it was really more of the progress and more of what we want to achieve in the projects that we do or in the research that we do, that ultimately the goal really is that we gain wisdom from not just from the science, but also from all disciplines, and also from everyone concerned. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz. So yes, and thank you as well, Dr. Shepard, for that question. So I guess it reads more of really not just making it from our point of view where we are at the center, but rather a multipodal discussion with our community. So we have another question. This one reads, does citizen science play a big part in your work on climate modeling? And if so, in what way?
I think citizen science would be useful because, for example, in weather observations or in reporting impacts, because all information, I mean, all the data is useful, but we have to also take care in making sure that the data is verified, or there is a certain standard if we were to use that information. So I think we can still improve the process involved in terms of citizen science, in that, for example, there can be a certain protocol that we can establish so that when they want to participate, then they could follow these steps. So that can also help the scientists who will be able to use that data. This is really more of, because even with data from observation stations, we have to go through quality control. And so I think we make better use of citizen science if there's also like information, and also for them to be part of the process, so they could have an understanding of how the data will be used, and so what are the considerations.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz. I suppose it's also a matter of where or which stage of the process citizen science is used. And I think the beautiful thing about the work that we do in the climate space is that the work is never technically really done. So there's always room for people's voices.
I think it's a very iterative process. So like, for example, I'm sure that was like from the data, information, knowledge, wisdom. Yeah, it's not really ending in with, I mean, not, at some point there might be some loops there. It's not really so very linear.
In relation to this, in relation to your answer, our next question reads, how do you overcome the barrier in letting stakeholders understand the research that you produce? So I suppose this participant wants to learn more about the stakeholder consultation process that you had. And they also write, can you tell us about a specific time when you had to address this barrier and what you did?
So I think it's really more of having a conversation. So it's if, for example, there are concepts that are not clear, then it's making sure that it is explained in the way that is something that is relatable to their personal experience. And so that's why I think it's really important that we have even informal conversations about their life, about how they plan, because it's in that process that we understand, their context, or what is their background, and so we can find ways in which to find common ground in, and also explaining, like, for example, what does it mean to have an extreme rainfall, and this could be explained in terms of its impacts. And impacts is usually something that is relatable. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. I love that answer, Dr. Cruz, because it really drives the point home that beyond just collaboration, it's also about creating a community.
Yeah.
So I suppose in that way, we're also shifting a lot of our paradigms in how we do the work that we do in the climate space. So thank you for that answer. Our next question is also about the workshop for Cordex, DOST Cordex. So their question reads, your stakeholder workshop for Cordex is very interesting. Postponed workshops notwithstanding, would you have any feedback from your participants on how their climate information needs or understanding have evolved since you conducted it?
I can't answer that at the moment, but I would very much like to have an opportunity to follow up with them. So we are still in touch with some of our partners. And so I really do hope that there would be another opportunity for us to check whether there has been advances, or also if they find if they find the information useful actually in their planning. And so it's very limited, because we're not also very many in the team, and there are many local governments. So it's very important that we establish relationships and to continue to collaborate, so that there's also that trust that if they have any needs, then they can also, they know that they can ask us and they can come back to us. So yeah, I think it would be good to try to, if we could try to establish ways to get their feedback. If we constantly also have projects, and so we hope that we can invite them again, and because the work really doesn't end. And we are also continually learning about this process. So I hope that there will be another opportunity to get back with them.
Yeah, indeed. I think that all of us in the Zoom and even our viewers on Facebook Live would agree that the pandemic has really disrupted a lot of our plans and how things, proceed. It's interesting how you mentioned working with local governments. I wonder if you can read my mind somehow, because our next question actually has to do with your work with local governments. So their question reads, from your experience, how receptive are local government partners to the information that you share with them? And how does it help them with their climate change adaptation and disaster risk and resilience planning?
From our engagement with them, I think they're very much open to this information, because it's also, we're not the only ones that in this space. So there are also efforts from Pag-asa, from the national governments, other organizations who have been working with local governments. So everyone is doing their share. And so it's from what I recall, I think it's really more of having access to the information, which can be a barrier. So it's also figuring out how they can access this in the format that they also need. So but there have been efforts also, for example, with Pag-asa. We have worked with them as I mentioned, in the last project. So the consolidated extremes information is now available online. So anyone can actually download that, those maps, provincial maps, the tables that show the extremes, climate extremes changes. And I'm hoping that it's already in a format that is usable, but if not, then it's something that we can further discuss. But that's the problem, actually. It's hard to anticipate because there's so many possible end users. It's hard to anticipate what format or what information would be useful for anyone. So that's why typically it could be in a format that we believe would be useful for many number of users, but it's still possible that some data will need to be in a format, let's say as a shapefile, because if that is something that is that the local government is more used to, or in this case, we have presented it as tables so that it would be also easier to understand. But if they need more information, then I think that's where the importance of having a continued collaboration or continued connection with the producers would come in, that there is this continued dialogue of what is needed and so what is available and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz. I think it's great that you mentioned access, because that is another dimension in making information more understandable, which is to make sure that it can actually reach, the intended audience and our different publics, and maybe what works for one group doesn't really mesh well with another group, and maybe another strategy needs to evolve from that. So I think this is something that we can all think about further. We have another question in the chat that we also just received. So let me just prioritize this. This is from Izuru Takayabu. They ask, is the activity in the Philippines you have introduced to us related with the estimation of loss and damage? So quite a timely question, given that this was also a major theme in COP27.
Thank you, Takayabu-san, for the question, and happy to see you here. So for that project, we looked at extremes, but I think we haven't yet explored whether we could use this for loss and damage. So that is actually very interesting to explore. From what I understand, we need to make sure that we have sufficient also observation data to support the study. But certainly, especially with the progress in the discussions on loss and damage, especially in the recently concluded COP27, it is something that we are interested in exploring.
Yes, it's great that you mentioned observation data, and in fact, it brings to mind what Dr. Laris Hamero from our previous webinar series, the Climate Voices webinar series, what she described as the need for attribution data.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you for also tying that in with Dr. Hamero's presentation.
Yes, actually, recalling that presentation, I was actually struck by the sharing of the youth and how of their experience of Odette. So I was actually talking with Dr. Lau and saying, oh, maybe it would be good for us to work together in sharing, what from their experience, what does the science say, or what do the observations and modeling show, so that they could, maybe it could help make sense of what happened, and also like tie together if they have any, for example, indigenous knowledge. What does that mean in terms of preparing better, or even understanding, being able to use early warnings and so on. So yeah, it's a very much interesting if to collaborate and to have these opportunities for sharing.
Yeah, that's great. And if I recall correctly, in one of your slides, you also mentioned that you had also worked with the local government in Tubigon, Bohol, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also because of Dr. Lau's connection. So
yeah,
that's we have some LGU partners which we hope that we can continue to nurture that engagement. Yeah.
It's great how we have these we start out as these tiny little silos, and then we emerge as these interconnected communities of practice.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. And I think it's also very great that you touched on indigenous knowledge in your previous answer. And our next question is actually about that.
Mhm.
So this anonymous asker has also sent us this message that you had a slide with including indigenous knowledge and that it is being considered in producing climate data. Could you share more about that and the process?
Mm. Well, it's more of, I think, in indigenous knowledge, more on the how to make sense of the information. We have not yet practiced that personally or in Manila Observatory, but in other areas, in other regions, I think that is something that they are trying to integrate into into like understanding the hazards, or maybe even incorporating in possible adaptation planning. But if I may be honest, yes, I'm still not yet familiar with that process, but it would be something that that would be interesting to pursue, because especially if you're dealing with local communities, indigenous knowledge would stem from experience, and so from it's something that can help us maybe also with explaining particular events, or for example, we've had this. I've had a conversation before in another series on using climate stories. So maybe through the stories that is rooted with indigenous knowledge, we could also be able to explain extreme events, or for example, in terms of early warnings. So relating that to how you might have, like for example, what Father Jet shared before, they would have some knowledge of, for example, when there's a storm coming, or for example, when to plant. Then we can link that with potential adaptation options. So yes, it's still something that there's so much to do, so much to learn. but yeah, I'm just putting it there also as a reminder to myself on what what we need to do, what we still need to accomplish.
Yes, I think a lot of us in this call can relate to, to the idea that we need to do this, but there's so much that we need to do, so much that we need to learn, because really learning never stops, and it's an iterative process. And I agree that it's really a fascinating thing to look at on how we can develop these more inclusive methodologies with indigenous groups, particularly since now climate justice is a major aspect that we need to consider, and that indigenous communities are among the most marginalized sectors in the world. So jumping off from that, I have another question here for you. And this person asked, you shared about how for AR6, different groups that previously worked within their topic started to work together. So the handover to handshake. Could you share more about that and what this approach brought to the table in terms of helping helping to make climate information become more usable?
Mm. So, for example, in our chapter, chapter 12, as I mentioned, it was through that collaboration between the two working groups that we came up with these climatic impact drivers, because it's really not just looking at the changes in climate variables, but in changes in climate variables that matter to some sectors, matter to society. So within that, there's already a context that was placed so that it's already usable. We find that the information will be useful. So although we find that there are only most of the climate variables do matter, but like that they all have sectoral relevance. But in any case, it makes it more, I think it already shows how you can already make the information useful. So it's not just, okay, we just look at temperature change, but for example, informed by what causes heat stroke or heat stress, then that already gives us an idea of what thresholds to look at and to see whether these thresholds have been exceeded in the future. So in that report, we only gave some examples, but definitely you can come up with different indices depending on which asset or sector you're looking at, because each one will have their own thresholds or their own limits. And so yes, so in that case, some areas of, so for example, some species might be more sensitive to a particular temperature, but other species may not be. They're still fine. So it's a matter of being aware that there are the circumstances, the context of what you're going to use that information for, and that's what we got from our interaction with the from the working group 2 people. Actually, we were very much careful because of that handshake that there is no overlaps. So that was the challenge. So they were like, when we were discussing, it was more of, oh, you're already, that's working group 2 territory. So, okay, so we have to go back and stay within. So we are informed by what are the sectors that working group 2 are looking at. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the climate information that would have some relevance for those sectors, but not saying that these are the changes, for example, in, so for example, if you're looking at health, human health, so we look at the changes in heat extremes, but not talk about how the impacts on health, because the impacts on health will be discussed in further by working group 2. So something like that. So it's a very, it was a good process, but at least, we both, I think we both learned from each other.
Yeah, I'm just curious about that. Did that happen a lot? The feedback between working groups about overlapping into each other's domains?
Oh yeah, I mean, because the assessment goes through several reviews. So in those reviews, we do invite reviews from the different working groups. So in that sense, they would be the ones looking at, oh, okay, I think this is more working group 2. So, okay, take a step, you can revise it. And so that it's more focused on the working group 1 domain. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cruz. Your answer, I think it really highlights, the title of our webinar series, especially the line, as if people mattered, and making sure that our work considers the impacts and, the face beyond the numbers. So if there are no more questions from the chat, this is a last call for any other questions that you may want to raise to our esteemed speaker. Okay. If there are none, then I'm happy to lead us to the next part of the program. So thank you very much, Dr. Cruz, and thank you very much as well to our participants for your questions and for the very engaging open forum. We now move to the awarding of the certificate. We present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Faye Abigail Cruz for sharing her time and insights in the webinar entitled Shifting from Handover to Handshake, Co-Generating Climate Change Information for Resilience on the 7th of December, 2022. The certificate is signed by Ms. Jean Jardeleza Mijares, the Program Manager for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and by Dr. Charlotte Kendra Gotangco Gonzales, the Director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and the focal point of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Cruz, for sharing your time and insights with us. I'm sure that I wasn't the only one who enjoyed hearing you talk and also the insights that you shared with us during the open forum.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to everyone who gave the challenging questions. No, but it's really, I'm very happy that I hope that it has been, you had it has been helpful in a way. So thank you very much.
And now, if we may have to deliver the closing remarks, may we call on Ms. Jean Jardeleza Mijares, the Program Manager for Climate and Disaster Resilience of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability.
Thank you, Daniel. It is my honor to deliver the closing remarks for today's session, closing as well the webinar series of the Hub for the year. A few months back when we for CDR, we're brain regional hub of MCR of My Climate Risk. We had a lot of the other MCR hubs across the globe. But throughout all that, we were also very much inspired by this article that you have heard a couple of times already, titled Small is Full Change MCR, Dr. Theodore Shepard and Dr. Regina Rodriguez. The concept of the webinar series we've hosted so far were grounded on many points raised in the paper, as well as on what we value in the CDR program, the need to harness a holistic and systems approach to help build the knowledge base and develop tools for climate and disaster resilience. The first webinar series on climate voices on the ground, for that, we explored what climate information needs of the different communities are, and we also heard from multiple perspectives and experiences of climate change. We took off from that toward this next webinar series, Climate Research as if People Mattered. And here we explore the bottom-up approaches in climate change science, climate communication, and climate risk management. This is the fourth session of the series, and looking back, it has just been a very rich series with very rich discussions from Dr. Vandana Singh's talk, reminding us of the value of stories and how we can learn from them and empower each other to co-create climate information. Moving to Mr. Raymond Rodolfo's session on engaging communities and different sectors as partners, not just as beneficiaries, gleaning from local knowledge to sustain coastal adaptation, to the talk of Dr. Ines Ponce de Leon on really harnessing the power of conversations, memories, and dreams as we do research and communicate about our climate. And today, the last session for the year, at least, where Dr. Faye Cruz shares about the conscious effort for different groups to work together, bridge information, and translate what climate information and products mean to society and ecosystems, emphasizing the need to understand each other, emphasizing understanding the needs and capabilities of communities, genuinely collaborating with them, and integrating socioeconomic considerations toward climate justice. I hope the sessions have also been helpful and valuable to you in reflecting on what it means to do research as care. Here, I would like again to refer to the article, Small is Beautiful, Climate Change Science as if People Matter, where Dr. Deborah Cohen is quoted and cited that for climate change science to be usable, there is a need to institutionalize research as care, care for data and its analysis, and care for people and their relationships. As someone trained in the field of environmental science, we're used to looking at various interrelationships in studying ecosystems. But it's always refreshing and humbling to take a step back and also learn from other disciplines in how they approach the understanding of relationships that we have with nature, with each other, with the data and information that allow us to take a peek at how nature works and how these relationships of people and of knowledge can help make communities resilient, make the world a better place. We are called now not just to understand these relationships, but more importantly, take care of them. And so I'm very grateful to Dr. Faye for sharing her time, experience, and reflections on the importance of these relationships, of collaboration, of understanding each other toward climate action, and really toward caring for our common home. On behalf of the CDR program and the Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub of My Climate Risk, I would also like to thank the World Climate Research Program and the MCR Secretariat for their support, helping us reach greater audience. We're also grateful as well to the Hub's co-collaborators from the different departments and institutions, Manila Observatory included, for being part of the series and really for the many ideas shared with us as we were only starting the Hub. I would also like to thank our colleagues in the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability under the leadership of Dr. Kendra Gotangco Gonzales, who is the focal point of the MCR Hub of Ateneo, whose guidance has been very inspiring. Thankful as well, of course, to Daniel Ratilla, our CDR program officer, the host for today and many sessions prior, for doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Apart from hosting, he's also been coordinating with various parties, handling tech, and helping ensure the smooth flow of the sessions. Thank you as well to the sign language interpreters, Ms. Edna Comia and Ms. Anna Tolentino, for making the sessions and discussions more accessible. And finally, we thank everyone who joined today and the previous webinar sessions. Your presence, your questions, your comments have all enriched the discussion and insight. Before I end, I would like to share that one of the words for care or to care in Filipino is pag-intindi. The root word intindi, when translated back to English, means to understand. Given this, I think it seems that caring then is really not separate from understanding. Thank you very much again for being here as we yearn to learn from each other, with each other, to understand and to care for our common home. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mijares, for closing not only this session, but also the entire webinar series. This is quite a meaningful session as it is also the culmination of the learning process that began with our previous webinar series, The Climate Voices on the Ground, Perspectives from Different Sectors. And as learning never stops, these sessions have given us a lot to ponder. At this point, may we request everyone to please turn your videos on momentarily for the group photo. This will also serve as our documentation. It's great to see everyone's faces. I recognize a lot of returning members of the audience, and I also see a lot of new faces. So welcome one and all. So I'll just give a few moments for the others to turn on their cameras as well. Okay. I'll be taking the photo in 3, 2, 1. I'll be taking a second photo. Okay. So please keep your smiles on. I'll be taking it now in 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. It is really an honor to have everyone with us here today. So as you have seen, and now you are seeing on the screen now, to our dear participants, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. Please answer the event evaluation form with the QR code and link flashed on the screen. Requests for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form. Thank you once again, Dr. Cruz, for sharing your insights and your time. We would also like to thank once again the sign language interpreters with us, the amazing Ms. Edna Comia and Ms. Annalisa Regis Tolentino. And to all of you, thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. We hope that you have gained fresh insights on co-creating climate change information and building our communities in the journey to address the climate crisis. Please don't forget To accomplish our event evaluation form, our tech team has posted the link in the chat. Again, requests for e-certificates will be coursed through the same form. And as Ms. Jean mentioned earlier, for 2 months now, we've explored different understandings of local contexts and experiences of climate change and the requirements of decision makers through the Climate Voices series. We've also explored how these contexts and experiences are considered and how we may apply these in research design and management plans in our climate research series. It has truly been a pleasure and a labor of love for the My Climate Risk Hub to deliver these 2 series to everyone, spanning 7 sessions and 8 esteemed speakers. The replays of all of our previous series and sessions are available on our link tree, which you may access through the QR code shown in the middle of the screen. Later today, this session will also be available there. So if you would like to be updated about the Hub's future projects, please answer our evaluation form so that you can have immediate access to all of our announcements for our future projects. And we do have exciting things planned for next year, so we hope to grow our community with you in it. And that is it for today's session. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks very much.